So then what we do is next we move to guidelines for error messages. So once we have user interfaces, naturally we also will have to deal with user making mistakes, right? And we have to give him a feedback saying something happened or error message, so to say. So error message design is critically important. It says poor error messages can mean that a user rejects rather than accepts a system. That's very important, right? So I'm not sure how many of us have noticed these strange type of errors, which in some applications you have something like, let me write it down, error minus 1154 for something like that, or error 0x0014, something like that, right? And many a times it does not make much sense to us as a normal user what this error means at all, right? So that might frustrate the user, and that's why it says that error messages, we have to be careful when designing the messages. And one of the guidelines it says is messages should be polite, concise, consistent, and constructive. So yeah, it has to be specific what exactly is going on. So you have to give a specific reason and be consistent in the language, consistent in how you display the messages, and constructive in a sense that once you give the message, hopefully you can guide the user for possibilities of correcting the mistakes. So that's very important. And naturally, the messages should be polite. The background and experience of users should be the determining factor in message design. Anyone who can tell me what can this mean? The background and user experience of users should be determining factor in message design.
I think, for example, if the
Yeah,
users of the program like are very like professional and specialists,
yeah,
the error message itself, it has to like have a lot of details, and it has to be specific and like matching their language that they can understand.
exactly. You're right.
While while for example,
Yeah.
if they are
So
like,
yeah,
oh sorry, for
yeah.
example,
Please continue.
if they are like well, for example, is it is for children or people that are not usually some specialists or stuff like that, we design a message that they can understand, stuff like that.
Exactly, very good. And similarly, the point what I was making here, error OX0014 might be a valid error message for people who might be in a very specific domain, right? And they want an exact error code. What is that? And they know how to deal with it. But that might not be for general end users. So yeah, you're right. You have to look at the background of the people to decide what is appropriate for a specific group of users. Similarly, if you're speaking about domain of medical software, the error messages should be based on their domain. And specific, if it is something in engineering, it should be targeted to the domain. So again, based on the idea that we know people are different, we have to also address that idea that okay, error messages should be based on their age, their background, their knowledge of computer, and so forth. So that's also very important. Let's see this one. This here it shows two different error messages. One of them is saying error number 27, invalid patient ID, right? So, and the opposite of that is saying that this is not a registered patient. Click on patients for list of patients, click on retry to re-input the patient's name, and click on help for more information. Okay, I don't know, there's some gaps, white spaces in between, maybe there's some image issue. Yeah, so look at these two email messages and think about this as you are a medical staff or using a medical software. How can you contrast or compare these two error messages? Any feedback, any input?
For the first one, as if I'm thinking about it, I see like an error, and I would think, oh, okay, I have an invalid patient ID, but I don't know about it, which might make me focus and rely more on like the technical support and stuff like that to explain to me how things are working.
Yeah, and
But
exactly. If I'm a medical staff, that might not be helpful for me, right?
yes,
Unless I'm an admin who is a part of computer background who has to deal with this stuff. So naturally, the right one looks more reasonable as a message, right? Yes,
yes.
please. You wanted to add something more?
While for the second one on the right, for me, it tells me immediately what I have to do, which gives the message of, oh, this is your problem and those are the solutions that you can do. So I already have the solution and I can fix the problem like independently without calling
Yeah.
technical
So
staff.
basically, yeah, you're right. So basically, what we can see here is this idea that this the on the right one. This is basically also constructive in a sense. It does not tell you only about the problem, but it gives you some possible way out, right? So maybe you would like to go for patient list. Maybe you want to try to re-input it, or maybe you want to go for the help. So it's basically more constructive in that sense. And also, there's a very fine point here. Let's look at this message. Although it has some white spaces, which makes a reading a bit more difficult. It says it's not a registered patient, and here it's saying invalid patient ID. If you look at it carefully, the one on the left, it is in a sense putting the blame on the user. It's saying that the patient ID you entered is invalid. So the blame is on the user. And on the right one, although this is the same thing, it's saying this is not a registered patient. Means we are not saying that you entered a wrong name, but whatever you want is not registered in our system. Is another way of saying that's invalid. But here the blame is on the system, not on the user. And this might look very trivial, but sometimes it does make a big difference. If you have a system which is quite, some people are using it for long time, long periods of time, and they keep getting some messages, and every time he sees and subconsciously the message blames the user, it raises the stress level. Whereas if you take the blame on the system, the user is not getting stressed out just because of that fact. So it was a very fine difference, but nevertheless, it's something very important to keep in mind. So you can see here, the second one on the right, it puts the blame on the system itself. On the left, it is the blame is on the user. And on the bottom side, you can see this table where you have these poor messages and better messages. These are some examples, by the way. So it says runtime error -2 and for this some code private profile string of object system failed. Again, if you're not into the domain, if you're not into some computer science and software engineering, your domain is not in this. This might not be much helpful for you. But if you see the right one, virtual memory space consumed, close some programs and retry. This is quite understandable and constructive in that sense. Similarly, there's another one which says resource conflict bus 00 device 03 function 01. Again, if you're not into this hardware domain, for most of the general users, this is not going to make much sense. But on the other hand, you can see this to remove your compact flash card and restart. Very, very understandable for most of the users, and it's again constructive. It's telling you what to do. Network connection refused. Your password was not recognized. Please retype. So you can compare these messages, right? You can see what could make a poor message as compared to what could be a better message. Bad day. Drop off date must come after pickup date. Again, you have some constructive messages, right? So if you have any question, let me know. Otherwise, I'll proceed from here.
Um,
Yeah, please.
excuse. Does for example, let's say that, okay, those better messages are very good for the end user. But for
Yeah.
example, if the problem is something that the end user can't fix, does like the technical staff have like a sheet where they have like, oh, the problem is your password was not recognized, please retype. They have like, oh, this is the problem in the design, and then they go and fix it. So do they have like a chart for errors to
Okay, this is
reference
a
to?
good question actually. Yeah, these are good questions, and again, it has a lot of details. But let me give you the summary of it. One thing is, yeah, if you have a error message, something which is for end user, something like on the right side. Now, what can happen is, let's assume that based on this error message, you need to contact some support. So there could be some option in the message which says copy the code and send it to the customer support, or contact customer support, or report this error to some online server or something, right? There, what you can do is encode inside it, which might not be necessarily visible to the user, although it can be, is the specific codes and things which could be important for diagnostics, right? So that can always be done. So you might also notice in many operating systems, you get some simple message on the top, but once you click details, it gives you more specific technical details, what exactly is going on internally. And you might have something called report this error or copy error and send it by email or whatever means it is. So yeah, you can have these multiple layers But generally speaking, for the end users, we have to be careful not to expose that internal details upfront. That's not something is very important for him or something which he can benefit a lot from it. The other thing is also you have to also ask this question: why does these in some computer software systems? Why does these type of message eventually come up appear? Right, these on the left side. Why do these messages eventually appear? The answer, one of the answers is that what happens is while the system is being debugged and tested, there are messages you embed in the code for debugging and testing, and these messages ought to be removed before the final deployment to the end user. But what happens is sometimes people forget to remove those uh, diagnostic or debugging messages which were meant for testing and debugging itself. So you know specific codes and you know how to deal with them. So these are some of the reasons why these type of messages also creep unintentionally at times, because they were supposed to be removed after debugging and testing. I hope this answers your question.
It does, thank you.
Okay, very good. So let's move forward. There are other things like web page design, guidelines for web page design. So if you can see here, there are some very common guidelines. It says minimize the page download time. That's of course very important, right? Because you know people are using different connection, different locations, and different types of internet plans. So you want to make sure that it's responsive, the web pages are responsive, and at the same time you don't have too much of data to be transferred. You want to minimize the data. So for example, if you have a background image in a web page, you typically want that image to be something very light in a sense of the space requirement, because you don't want that very heavy huge message, I'm sorry, heavy background image need to be downloaded by the user, and it consumes a lot of their internet bandwidth, for example. So you have to be careful about that in web page design. One of timeout. So most of the web pages or websites, they have these sessions, right? So if a session is going to expire, you want to warn of the timeout. This is also something important to keep in mind. Provide feedback when user must wait. So if there's something going on, it's processing. Typically also in websites, it's not like a standalone local software. The website has to communicate through the internet to a server, get the response, render back the results. So sometimes it takes a lot of time, right? So in that case, you should give some feedback. So some sort of slider, some feedback to make user know that the website has not just lost connection, it's processing something. So that's important. Provide feedback when user must wait. Another one is provide text equivalents for non-text elements. Anyone who can tell me what can this mean? Actually, what happens in most of the websites are that websites are multimedia, right? So it's not only text, it might be images, it might be videos and stuff like that. So wherever you have non-text elements like an image or a video or whatever, a graph, a diagram, a figure, you provide some a textual equivalents for those elements. Now, why do you want to do this? For example, in images, there is a tag. If you go to website design, you see there is something called ALT, alternate, right? ALT. So alternate means an alternate text equivalent for an image. Why do you want to do something like that? There are many reasons for that. Anyone who can think about any reason about this? Why do you want to provide textual equivalents for non-text elements? Any reason you can think about? Why, for example, for an image or a video or a figure or diagram, you want to provide some text as a replacement for those figures in case it's needed? Any situation you can think about? For example, what if the system is unable to download that image for you? It was not downloadable. For some reason, that image did not get downloaded, or the image is not existing. So if you have a non-textual textual equivalents, what happens is these text appears in the place of an image, for example, or a figure or a video. So you can at least look at the textual description to understand what exactly is going on. That is one example. So textual equivalents are good. The other thing is also very important is many times web page are many people who have problems with eyesight might use something called optical character recognition. on-screen readers. So there are tools, right, in many of the web browsers which can read out the text for the now equivalents for some figure. You might have those. You can write a paragraph, for example, explaining the figure. So it says, okay, this figure is a bar chart which shows the number of students enrolled in CSWE and CS and for example, COE for the year 2019, and it shows that computer science students, there were this number, these SW students was this number, and C number. So they validate. And if if someone uses a screen reader, although he does not see this bar chart, for example, he can still understand what's going on, what is it exactly all about. So that helps a lot in many situations. So I hope this is clear, right? Another thing is check for broken and dead links. This is also something you have to keep doing every now and then, right? So make sure that you don't have some dead links or broken links in your web pages. So you click a link and it does not open any page or anything. It just says you, for example, page not found, right? Error number 404, page not found, something like that. So you have to make sure in your website, always keep checking for this every now and then. Also, because websites are used by many people around different places, so people use different platforms, mobile devices versus desktop PCs versus different other hardware platforms. You have different browsers, different screen resolution. So the idea is a website, the portability requirements are quite high as compared to a standalone application or an app, which was designed for a specific platform, because people might use different browsers, different operating systems, and so forth. So make sure that you satisfy at least the most common settings. So you might have to say, okay, at least it satisfies the most common, most popular 2 or 3 browsers. At least it supports the most popular operating systems, and so forth. So you have to make sure that the portability requirements are met. So is there any question on this, or we move forward? Okay. Now comes some of the user interface design guidelines for mobile devices. So one of them, it says take advantage of the whole screen. So because the mobile devices, the screen is smaller as compared to a normal standalone computer, you make sure that the screen resolution, the whole of the screen is made use of, right? And there's a term which is sometimes used, is called the, sorry, this screen real estate. Sense, every point, every pixel in the screen is valuable to make the best use of it, right? So this is something important. Saying that your buttons, wherever you use them, you need to tap or click.
Doctor, can't hear you.
Is not visible.
We can't hear you, doctor.
Oh, you can't hear me. Is this true now? You can't hear me?
Yeah, we
It was
can.
like
The voice is not that clear, right?
Yes.
yeah, it's lagging.
I don't know what's going on. So it seems there's some delay in the connection. Yeah, is it okay? Can you see the screen now?
I
Yes.
think it's frozen.
No, I didn't move it now, but can you see now?
My screen. Yeah.
Okay, so let's move forward then. So we are saying, yeah, make sure that the users can understand primary content at its default size, right? So you have to be also careful because mobile devices, the screen is small, so you have to be sure that whatever you display, textual messages and normal size, default size is legible. Of course, there can be options for people to enlarge it or smaller, but at least the default size should be visible for most of the users. It says avoid asking users to rate your app too soon. This is also applicable for websites, right? These days it's not a bigger issue, but many times it happens, or it used to happen. You visit a website or you download an app, immediately in a few seconds or few minutes, it asks you to rate it. That becomes quite annoying, right? For many reasons. One of the reasons is that yeah, you might not be very interested to rate it that soon. And also, how can you rate something which you have not experienced? So you have to be careful of asking this rating things, right? When your app restarts, restore its state to users so that users can continue where they left off. This is also important, right? So many times we switch between apps in the mobile phone. So to switch between apps, you make sure that you save the current state of this system, right? So that you don't have to go through the process. You restart from where you left out. In general, use a single font for the app. So it's not a good idea to use multiple fonts unless there's a specific reason to do so. Okay. This image is showing about the screen of a mobile device. It says, generally speaking, and this holds mainly for the English-based screen. Of course, for Arabic, it will be the opposite. It says the top left corner is the most important area of the screen, and the bottom right corner is the least important. How they came up with this? What happened is, what they do is they put some eye, and people, once they go and they use the screen, these eye trackers keep track of the eye movement and see how much people focus or put attention in a given region. And they found that people normally would focus mostly on the top left corner. This is the bottom right corner. So it says that if you have important information, you should try to organize in that sense, that you put the important information on the top left and less important as you go bottom and towards the bottom. Okay. Of course, for the Arabic, it will be just the opposite. Any question on this? I hope you can hear me now. Is my Can you hear me now?
Yeah, we can hear you, but it's hard
Okay,
sometimes.
good. Yeah, I understand. I don't know. For some reasons, it seems his internet is not responsive. But let's see how we can deal with that. Yeah. So let's look at these two examples: the left side and the right side in the screen. Which one do you think is the better one?
Left.
Yeah. So yeah, it might look nice that you have very fancy looking fonts and different types of font, but generally speaking, if people keep using your app, they would normally prefer thing which is simple and consistent. That's important. So the left one is generally speaking a better option. Okay. Again, there might be special reasons why you might have very fancy fonts, but we are speaking in general. So go for simplicity, go for consistency, and yeah, instead of having too fancy and not using some fonts also is another aspect to look at. Similarly, what is this trying to explain? This particular screen. Any idea here?
That we should be consistent with our fonts rather than it changed just now.
Oh, okay. Yes. So this one.
Um, I think that we shouldn't the lightning is really like bothering me when I look at the screen. Like I wish it wasn't there so I can like smoothly look at the text of the weather.
Yeah, yeah, I know people have very mixed responses for this particular screen. Actually, I took it from the Apple's website, maybe it might be 2, 3 years back, and they were using this as an example to say that sometimes you might have to think out of the box. As far as I remember, this was the point. So if you look at this, sometimes what happens is a given particular user, once he's looking at the weather, he's not interested in each and every numbers and details. He just want to know the overall idea. So this is giving you, immediately you know there are thunder, lightning and thunder going on. So And there's also something is showing that it's using the full screen. So the text, the image of this thunder, instead of just limiting it to one part, it's using the full screen. And if a person is interested to read in details, he can still read it. But I understand there might be other concerns that maybe it's not that easily readable in there. Yeah. So you can look at it from both sides. Yeah, that's all. And again, more guidelines. So these are just some guidelines. There are so many other guidelines can be used. We mainly spoke about menu design. We spoke about guidelines for using colors, websites, mobile devices, and so forth, right? But keep in mind there can be many different guidelines, very specific guidelines, very detailed guidelines for various different aspects of UI design, right? So there's no end to it. This is just an introductory course, and this is an introduction to UI design. So this should general suffice us. Another part of user interface design, or so to say, generally speaking, of usability, is the idea of user manuals, online help, and tutorials, right? So there are different things you should be careful about. So one of them is paper manual. Once you normally in hardware devices, you know paper manuals, but for software, most of the time, the paper manual has been reduced a lot, right? Also because of the idea of green environment, not misusing papers and stuff like that. But also at the same time, because people can now, most of the people are connected to the internet and they can online access manuals anytime. So yeah, generally speaking, the first point you have to keep in mind is you should have some user manual for your software. Having a printed paper manual might be an option, but not very popular these days. But online manuals is a good option. You have to also be careful about the content of the manual, how you write your manual, how you organize the writing. And again, you have to always keep in mind the end users in picture, who is going to read this manual. So the language, the text should be based on that. Context sensitive interactive help. Apart from manuals, you should also have some helps, right? So, for example, if you type F1, you trigger an interactive help. You should have some sort of, right. And what does it mean to be? And you press F1 or help, whatever it could be. You get help specifically for this you're doing right now, not a general help where you can search and look for your solution. So context help is a better approach than just an online help, so to say. Similarly, you have tutorials and demonstrations, and that might be good for people who are using the software as a newcomer, right? So if I put it your software, it might be good to have some tutorial in the beginning to show the user the main usage of the software and main ideas, right? And last but not least, it's also good to have, if you can, have some frequently asked questions of your manual or help, or it could be also documented somewhere else. And if something, a software is very important and there is a lot at stake in this software, you might also have some customer care where people can maybe either directly interact through the software system or maybe have a number, phone number, and you call for that particular problem. And again, if it's not through the software, then this customer care is not part of user interface design per se. You might just have a number, a call phone number to display saying that contact this number. But it also nevertheless comes in the overall user experience, right? So user interface design is part of the whole umbrella of user experience. That's also an important thing, right? So there's something called user experience, right? And under the user experience umbrella, you have one of the things which is very important is user interface design. Sorry. Yeah, so this also have to be kept in mind. Maybe something towards the end, we are speaking about now the usability attribute. So if we speak about usability as a product requirement, quality requirement, what are some of the important measures to measure usability? So one of the thing is learnability. How long does it take for a new user to become productive with the system? It could be few hours, few months, few weeks, depending on the problem, the domain of the software, and how big the software is, and how critical the software is. So you might have some measures for that. So for example, most of the users will get used to the most common 80% of the functionality after 4 hours of training, for example. Or using the app for 1 week may make the user use most of the common functionality, something like that. Learnability. Speed of operation is another aspect of user interface design. So if you have something to do, how fast you can do that job, because sometimes user interface design itself can be the limiting factor, right? So think about, for example, a software system for a bank teller. And a bank teller might be dealing with many customers and they're waiting for their turn. So you don't want user interface to be a hindering factor, to a factor as a bottleneck. So you want to make sure that user interface is optimized so that the bank teller can process the request as soon as possible. As an example, robustness, of course, your user interface design, if you put some invalid values or you'd make some mistakes, how robust it is for those user errors. And recoverability is the idea that if it eventually makes some mistakes, how can you undo or stuff like that, redo, undo, and saving. If the system crashes, can you save your system data and stuff like that? That's also one part of user interface design. Yeah, so this basically brings us to the end of the discussion on user interface design. If you have any question on this, please let me know. Anyone has a question here, let me know. I'm aware that it could be that the voice is not that clear. It seems there's some problem with the internet connection. But again, if you can still understand what we discussed and you have some questions, please let me know.
Excuse me, teacher.
Yes, please.
About the part in the project that is talking about the interface, what are we supposed to do exactly?
Okay, in the design document, your interface should ideally be this. If you're going for a textual interface, you show exactly how the interface will look like. And if you're going for a graphical user interface, at this point of time, you should try your best to use some Java GUI builders, right? You have something in Eclipse, you have something in NetBeans, where you can drag and drop, for example, and show your user interface, how it will look for different functionality. Ideally, this should be the case.
Okay, thank you so much.
So you make sure that your text is aligned, your color choice, your logo, whatever you can do, try to do your best.
Okay, thank you.
All the best. Anyone having any question? A question related to user interface design topic or your project, you can discuss it now.
Excuse me.
Yes.
In the step in the project about the block diagram and the architecture, there is some confusion on what to do in it.
Okay, let me know where is the confusion.
The confusion is how to form the block diagram that is wanted, plus what a connection does the block diagram have with the architecture that we are using itself.
The block diagram is your architecture, right?
Yes.
So based on what you decided to your architecture to be, you're going to create the block diagram. For example, let's put it this way. What do you think will be your overall architecture for the system?
Repository.
Yeah, so let's assume it's repository, right? So you will say in your block diagram, you'll create a repository. So you might say that, I'm sorry, you might say something like a repository saying, what do you have? The registration database, right? Registration database, and you put some is this one. So this is related to course catalog management. I'm just giving examples. Course catalog management, and this speaks with the repository. What about this one? This could be course schedule management. And again, just I'm putting it right. It could be based on functionality as a subsystem. It could be based on the user. At this stage, it's not very important, but at least you have something meaningful. So here you might say, for example, account management and stuff like that. You can have different ideas. But then for, yeah, I'm sorry, for each of the module, you might say, okay, each module is a three-tier architecture, it's a layered model. So the client side is the presentation layer, the UI, this speaks with the, for example, your application logic layer, where you make decisions, you decide something which is on the server side more, for example, and then you have the database, or even before database, for example, I'm sorry, where is the eraser? Okay, for example, you might also have something called entity layer, where you have the information stored. And this entity layer is speaking with the database. So it's a layered model for each subsystem. Each subsystem is a layered model, and the whole system is a repository model. But then you have to give examples. What is this presentation system? For example, this is your account management system. And this application logic layer decides which type of role you want to create and based on what to store. Does this username exist in the system or no? Just give an idea. You don't have to explain for each and everything, just an idea.
Oh, I see. So basically, we choose which architecture we are following. Then, based on it, we make a block diagram like in the same
Yeah,
style of
first you
this
have to decide.
architecture.
Yeah, so what I'm saying is for the repository model, if this is your overall architecture, you have to make it complete. In a sense, you show the repository in the center and you show all the different subsystems which are applicable for your software. But then just take one subsystem as an example and say each subsystem is going to be a layered architecture and something like this.
Hmm. Huh.
Yeah, and assuming again, just I'm going to make it complete for discussion. What about the architecture for this thing, the presentation layer? If it is a GUI based system, that will be an event based system. So three different architectures at three different levels.
Oh, but how do I like
So the
say it?
whole,
Like, uh,
yeah. So first you make this diagram. You say the overall software architecture is a repository model. You show this repository, show the subsystems. Then give one example of one subsystem. Say it could be thought of as a layered model, and you have this layer where you have the subsystem. This is the application logic layer, then the entity and the database,
hmm.
the repository. You see, so this repository is exactly this repository.
But another question, please.
Yeah.
For example, let's say that okay, I have the repository, and one of the subsystems is layered.
Each
Um,
subsystem could be layered. Yeah.
yeah, sorry, each subsystem is layered, but do I
Yeah.
need to show each layered subsystem,
No,
or
no, that's
just
what I'm saying. Just take an example of one layered system and just give the idea.
so I
One
don't
of them.
need so I don't need in the fourth like in the architecture step,
No,
I don't need to show exactly every block diagram.
no, you don't. You don't have to, you have to show the repository model and one of the layered architecture, for example,
Ah, I
and
see.
explain that all of the subsystems are following the same architecture.
I see. Thank you.